So tonight we're learning about the history of solidarity and the struggle of working people in the South. Most people don't know a lot about labor history, which is to say most working people in this country don't know a lot about our own history as working people. And most people definitely don't think that there's a radical history of labor and tenant struggle in the Deep South, because we're not taught this history in our textbooks. It's not on television. So it's so important to participate in events like this, to study the experiences of working people, their struggles, those who came before us, place them into the context of the time, but also understand how these movements have long-lasting influences that we are still affected by today. So I'm going to talk about the Alabama Sharecroppers Union, but I'm going to talk about more broadly the Alabama Communist Party, which was organized in Alabama in the 1930s. It existed from about 1929 until the early 40s, and they organized the Sharecroppers Union, which at its height had like 10,000, primarily like 98% Black workers. They also organized in the factories and mines in Alabama, and they organized the unemployed. So to inform this talk, I drew heavily from three texts: Black Worker in the Deep South, which is the memoirs of Hosea Hudson, who was one of Alabama's radical Black labor leaders; Indignant Heart, a Black Worker's Journal, which is the autobiography of Charles Denby, who was a Marxist organizer, a party member, and a factory worker who grew up in Alabama; and of course, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, which was published almost 28 years ago by Dr. Robin Kelley. So before we jump into the 1930s, I want to talk briefly about the radical history of militant labor and tenant organizing and anti-racist organizing that took place in the decades preceding the first party activity in Alabama. So in Indignant Heart, Charles Denby writes that in the 1910s, when he was a boy, abusive landlords would awake to see their barns had been burned down in the middle of the night, torched by some anonymous tenant whose name would never be given up by fellow sharecroppers. Denby tells of how Black people would take up arms against marauding white gangs who made to lynch them, or would stand up against the abuses of their landlords, even as they knew to do so meant reprisal or death. Historically, open collective rebellion of Black sharecroppers was virtually impossible, as they were separated from one another by miles. Instead, individualized forms of resistance were used: theft, arson, sabotage, to win material concessions or to retaliate against unjust landlords. And in Birmingham, the working class was by no means docile. In the 1870s, James T. Rapier, the Black leader of the Labor Union of Alabama, had tried to organize industrial and agricultural workers throughout the state. In the 1880s, the Knights of Labor and the Greenback Labor Party established a tradition of militant interracial unionism amongst Birmingham's coal miners. The United Mine Workers organized in Birmingham until it was crushed in the coal miners' strike of 1894. All told, there were 603 strikes initiated by Alabama workers between 1881 and 1936, half of which took place before 1905. After World War I, the radical labor movement went into a decline as employers developed more effective tactics to bust workers' organizing, including the extensive use of racism to foster division between Black and white workers. The KKK also grew dramatically in the 1920s and emerged as one of Alabama's most powerful political forces. So this is the political landscape that party organizers, and when I say party, I'm talking about the Communist Party. I'll just refer to it as the party from here on out. This is the political landscape that party organizers came into when they first went down to Alabama. So at first, the party thought that they would recruit the young white workers of Alabama's mines and factories. But they found that the white workers who were interested in what they had to say were hesitant to face almost complete social exclusion from their communities for sympathizing or openly affiliating with Reds. The people who were most interested in what the party had to say were Black people. So these Black men and women came from the farms, factory, mines, kitchens, and city streets of Alabama. They came carrying the weight of their race, class, and gender, with their histories and their collective memories. The movement was homegrown by people without a Euro-American left-wing tradition. Black working people in Alabama interpreted far-left politics through the lenses of their own cultural worlds and the international movement of working people that they now belong to. These were not people waiting for political direction from outside. They were people who entered the movement with a rich culture of opposition. Yet while the movement in Alabama resonated with the traditions of Black working people, it offered something fundamentally different as well. It proposed a new kind of politics that required the self-activity of poor people. Today, socialism and other far-left political philosophies are often associated with the privileged class, with academics, or like Fox News's idea of black anarchists or something. And some of us think this type of politics only appeals to white people or only appeals to men. But for the majority of the history of the left, this has not been the case. This was not the case in Alabama, where party membership throughout its entire existence was majority working class Black people, where the party was not just, people in a room talking about theory, but they were directly rooted in the everyday struggles of poor and working people in Alabama, both in the cities and in the rural areas. So at its height, between the party's direct membership and its members in the Sharecroppers Union, the various communist units in the industrial and mining sectors of Alabama, and in its women's and youth auxiliary groups, the party touched the lives of 20,000 or more people. So despite initial assumptions that the bulk of the party's membership in the Deep South would be young whites who are not so weighted down by the prejudices of their parents, from the beginning the party in Alabama was an almost entirely Black organization focused on Black issues, with a membership made up of unskilled and semi-skilled industrial workers, sharecroppers, and domestics with no previous experience in organized radical left-wing movements. The party offered a working-class alternative to the conservative, middle-class, and business-minded Black organizations like the NAACP and the Tuskegee Institute. So in March of 1930, the party held its first mass meeting in Birmingham. 200 participants crowded into a packed hall to hear speeches from party organizers and workers who talked about an end to the lynching of Black people and the right of self-determination for Black people in the South. They advocated for social and economic equality and called for the abolition of segregation in Alabama. The meeting went down without a problem, but within days, one of the speaker's houses was firebombed. So this meeting made a lasting impression on several attendees, including an 18-year-old Black coal miner named Angelo Herndon. Herndon was radicalized in these early years of the 1930s and went on to become one of the party's most active organizers in Birmingham. So the party didn't restrict its activities to the city of Birmingham. In 1931, it founded the Sharecroppers Union in Tallapoosa County, Alabama. At its height, the Sharecroppers Union was a mass organization of tens of thousands of militant farmers. It agitated through strikes and other forms of resistance to win concessions from the landlords and local government and to promote the liberation of rural Black people in Alabama. Black sharecroppers joined in droves to the first iteration of this union, though they faced brutal repression. Armed bands of white people would invade their meetings and beat the Black workers in attendance. In the summer of 1931, a meeting in Camp Hill, Alabama, was attended by 150 Black sharecroppers. The meeting was interrupted by white vigilantes and the local police force. Ralph Gray, a Black leader of the Sharecroppers Union and a member of the party, was beaten and shot to death by the white mob. Dozens of Black Union members were arrested by the police and charged with conspiracy to murder, charges which were later dropped after the party sent lawyers down to defend their members in court. So in response to the violent repression the Sharecroppers Union faced in its early days, they changed its strategies. Union locals no longer held mass meetings in vacant houses, but instead met in small groups, secretly every week. Locals would hold their meetings under the guise of Bible study sessions, and meeting minutes were often kept by underlining words and phrases from the Bible. Keep in mind, a lot of these people didn't know how to read or write at all. But despite violent repression, the Communist Party in Alabama grew rapidly, and the Sharecroppers Union went on to win major victories. By June of 1933, the union's membership was estimated at 2,000. 15 months later, it stood as high as 8,000 members. At its height in 1936, the union had between 10 and 12,000 members until it was disbanded by the party. Al Murphy, who was a core organizer for the party and a leader of the Sharecroppers Union, summarized some of their accomplishments in a pamphlet titled Achievements and Tasks of the Sharecroppers Union. The union was able to force landlords on multiple plantations to cancel all debts against their sharecroppers. They won immediate relief from landlords in the form of clothes, medicine, and food, as well as cash relief. They won sharecroppers on some plantations the right to sell their own cotton directly instead of having it mediated through the landlords. They won equal pay raises for women and men and continuations of much-needed food advances during wintertime. So how did the Sharecroppers Union win such victories when faced with brutal anti-worker and white supremacist repression from both plantation landlords and the state? Dr. Robin Kelly discusses this in his book Hammer and Hoe. He shares this fun anecdote. He says, "I wasn't prepared for characters such as Lemon Johnson, a former member of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union. In December 1986, I visited Johnson at his home in rural Montgomery County, which I described in my journal as a tiny rundown shack with battered wooden walls, a rusted tin roof that had begun to cave in, and a porch stocked with 3 rickety chairs. He fed me a huge lunch of collard greens, beans, Wonder Bread, fried chicken, and a slice of cake. We ate outside and talked for a while. When it became unbearably cold, we moved inside. I sat on his bed as he slouched in a wooden chair next to me. A faded picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was tacked to the wall above his head. He told me stories about the 1935 cotton pickers strike and the night a well-armed group of women set out to avenge their comrades who had been beaten or killed during the strike. When I asked Mr. Johnson how the union succeeded in winning their demands, without the slightest hesitation, he reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a dog-eared copy of Lenin's What Is to Be Done and a box of shotgun shells, set both firmly on the bed next to me and said, right there, theory and practice. That's how we did it, theory and practice. But the party did not just organize sharecroppers and industrial workers. They organized the poor and the unemployed, emphasizing strong connections between struggles in the workplace, the neighborhood, and the community at large. After lying low for a few months following the firebombing incident at its first mass meeting in Alabama, the party resumed its organizing efforts, holding large gatherings and demonstrations throughout Birmingham. In May of 1930, 700 blacks and 100 whites gathered in what's now known as Lynn Park in downtown Birmingham to demand relief for unemployed workers and to protest the recent arrest of 6 party members in Atlanta. In June of that year, 250 black workers attended a demonstration in downtown Birmingham to protest a city ordinance aimed at suppressing party activity. Demonstrations were held for relief and in protest of repression throughout that summer, despite the harsh response of the police, who arrested prominent party members like the black organizer Gilbert Lewis, charging them with the crime of advocating social equality between whites and Negroes. So the party continued holding demonstrations in the city in support of relief for unemployed workers, but they did not just protest. Having little faith in petitions, demonstrations, or boycotts alone, the party organized councils of the unemployed and neighborhood relief committees who dealt with members' specific grievances on an individual basis and presented demands directly to the Birmingham Welfare Board. These committees fought against evictions and foreclosures, among other activities. So in the first 5 years in Alabama, the party operated underground. Violent repression had taught them not to agitate openly. Most of their organizing was done in secret. They relied on the Black Southern tradition of quiet subversion. For instance, when they wanted to put out leaflets, black women from the party would often pose as laundry workers and carry what appeared to be laundry to a comrade's house. Inside their baskets, they would hide paper and a machine for printing. To pass out leaflets, they would go to the factories or the mines before the workers started their shifts and drop dozens of leaflets on the ground, letting the wind blow them around and then pretending they didn't know anything about it. In rural areas, they would put up posters and leaflets in trees late at night when no one would see them. If someone's electricity got turned off because they couldn't afford to pay their bill, they would use jumper cables to run electricity into their house. If someone had trouble with a social worker who wouldn't let them on the relief roll so they could get food to feed their families, party members would get dozens of postcards and write to the social worker anonymously saying, "The workers are watching you." 2 years after they came to Alabama, the party was organizing rallies of up to 5,000 workers. By the end of 1933, the party had close to 500 dues-paying members in Birmingham alone. What they offered was a framework for understanding the roots of poverty and racism. They linked local struggles to world politics, challenging not only the dominant ideology of white supremacy, but also the racial politics of the black middle class. They created a forum for ordinary people to analyze, discuss, and criticize the society in which they lived. Publications like The Southern Worker carried articles describing struggles in Africa and the Caribbean, which inspired workers eager to read about the liberation of Black people around the world. Workers would meet on Sundays after church to study Marxist theory and working class history together. Some, like Hosea Hudson, taught themselves to read and write through party-led political education programs. These study groups provided to Black workers what white society had too often denied: an education and a foundational theory to understand the roots and the connections between poverty, wealth, and racism. But despite the activity of the party and its thousands of members, it was not easy to be read in 1930s Alabama, as I'm sure we can imagine. This is what Hosea Hudson said about his union organizing with the party in those early years. "We was up against some pretty rough terror. Those days was rough. You couldn't pity-pat around with people. We would tell people that when you join, it's like the army. But it's not the army of the bosses, it's the army of the working class organizing to make things better." By 1936, the party had reached a new height of influence in Alabama. The Sharecroppers Union had 10 to 12,000 members. The International Labor Defense, which focused on civil rights issues, was on the verge of overshadowing Black middle-class organizations. The dozens of party-led rank-and-file committees in Alabama mines and factories were infused with hundreds of new recruits. Yet by the mid-1940s, the party faced betrayal from its liberal allies, purges from the major unions, and repression from the state. From 1939 to 41, 50 anti-union bills were introduced into the US Congress. In 1949, the CIO sent down directives to purge all those suspected of being party members. Hosea Hudson writes that in his book that in 1947, he was purged from the union local he helped to found a decade prior and was blacklisted for his communist beliefs. In 1950, the Birmingham City Council, working alongside the KKK, passed a city law banning communist activity. In 1951, a law was passed requiring all party members to register with the Department of Public Safety or face a $10,000 fine and prison sentence. So this caused the party to formally disband, and dozens of its organizers fled north or went underground. But we've got to recognize the accomplishments of the party in Alabama. It not only organized tens of thousands of sharecroppers to dramatically improve their living and working conditions, they also laid the foundations for racial justice movement organizing in the South. And in fact, the most prominent rhetoric used against the party at the time was that they advocated for social equality, which was a concept so radical for 1930s Alabama that the popular press largely ignored their more extreme calls for Black self-determination and the overthrow of the government and all that stuff. So the party cast a long influence on Alabama's radical movements. Many future union organizers and leaders of the civil rights movement cut their teeth in the party's ranks. Asbury Howard, a labor organizer, civil rights leader, and state legislature, was trained in the party. Rosa Parks, while never an official member, attended party meetings and was trained at the Highlander Center, which is a Tennessee organizer school that still exists to this day and was founded by party members. As Black communists like Claude McKay and Richard Bright would later argue, through the party's courageous struggles for equality and liberation in the face of violent repression, it built the foundation for the radical ideals of the civil rights movement. The party and its struggles are beacons of history that today's radicals, Black and white, should continue to look to. I think it's really important for us to focus on not only militant labor struggles, but on the political ideas of the radicals that embedded themselves in those struggles, understanding how this is part of our history as working people, as socialists, and also how do we direct the organizing that's taking place in the DSA today in a way that mirrors some of the accomplishments of the radicals who came before us. So like I said, one of the main things that the party provided to people was a means of empowering themselves through analyzing the world that they lived in a way that wasn't provided to them in school, if they even got an opportunity to go to school, but also bringing socialist and communist ideas directly into the labor movement, emphasizing within our organizations how important it is to organize workers and to understand how that is really at the root of everything that we want to accomplish. So, I want to conclude my talk with this excerpt from an early edition of The Southern Worker, which is one of the party's newspapers, which read as follows. "It is clear there is only one way out of hunger and death and that is to break down the walls of segregation, Jim Crowism, and lynching by a united front of all poor people, white and colored, against the bosses and the landlords for bread and for freedom. Thank you.